The knife was already at Yelena Dumont's throat when Orsino Malkavian walked through the door. He did not rush, he did not shout. He simply stopped in the doorway of his own throne room. 700 years of glacial composure settling over his features like winter frost over stone, and looked at the vampire holding her with the kind of calm that was more terrifying than rage. "Release her," he said, his voice barely above a murmur, and yet it carried to every corner of the vast vaulted chamber. "Release her, Valdis, and I will make your death quick." Yelena could feel the blade against her pulse. She was not shaking. She had made a decision, somewhere in the last 30 seconds, that she would not give whoever was holding her the satisfaction of watching her tremble. Her medical bag had been knocked across the black marble floor, its contents scattered, sterile bandages, syringes, vials of carefully prepared compounds she had spent 3 weeks developing. She catalogued the distance between herself and the nearest vial with the same clinical focus she brought to emergency rooms at 2 in the morning. "You will not kill me," the vampire named Valdis said from behind her, his arm like iron across her chest. He was one of the old court, she knew that much, one of the pale, beautiful, terrifying creatures who orbited Orsino's world like dying stars around a black sun. His white hair spilled over her shoulder, his breath was cold against her ear. "Your blood law forbids it. I am of the third house. You cannot spill third house blood without the council's sanction." "You are correct," Orsino said, and he walked forward, each step slow and deliberate across the marble. His white hair was unbound tonight, falling to his broad shoulders, his formal black coat immaculate, his eyes, dark as the space between stars, fixed on Valdis with absolute, consuming focus. "I cannot kill you here without sanction," he paused. "But she is not bound by blood law. She is human. She is my guest, and if you put one mark on her, I will find a way to dismantle every protection your house has spent 4 centuries building, and I will do it with a smile on my face." It was not a bluff. Yelena had known Orsino Malkavian for 3 months, and she had learned very quickly that he did not bluff. Valdis's grip loosened by a fraction. It was enough. Yelena dropped her weight, twisted the way she had learned in the self-defense course she had taken 2 years ago, after a violent patient in the emergency ward had changed her understanding of the world, grabbed Valdis's forearm and stepped hard on his foot. It did not hurt him. He was a vampire, but it surprised him, which was all she needed. She pulled free, took 3 steps toward the scattered contents of her bag, and turned to face both of them, a loaded syringe in her hand. "Ultraviolet compound," she said, and she was pleased that her voice was completely level. "Concentrated. I have been refining this formula for 8 weeks. I have not tested it on a vampire yet, but my calculations suggest it will work considerably better than anything currently on the market." She looked at Valdis. "Would you like to be my first trial?" There was a silence in the throne room that stretched like taffy pulled by something very large and very cold. Then Orsino laughed. It was not a sound she had heard from him before. In 3 months of working in the private medical suite beneath his city residence, of treating the injuries his people brought to his court, of learning the geography of his world with the same careful attention she gave to a new hospital, she had heard him be wry, she had heard him be dry. She had once heard him make a remark so sardonic that the ancient vampire receiving it had actually taken a step backward. But she had never heard him laugh with genuine, startled delight. Valdis fled. She did not see how exactly, because she was watching Orsino, but there was a movement and a rush of cold air, and then they were alone. Orsino crossed the distance between them and stopped 2 feet away, and the laughter faded, replaced by something that was harder to name. He looked at her. Really looked at her in that way he sometimes did, as though she were a problem he was still in the process of solving, and the solution kept surprising him. "Are you injured?" he asked. "No," she said. "Are you?" Something moved across his face. "I was not the one with a knife to my throat." "No," she agreed. "You were the one who walked into a room where a member of your court was holding a human hostage in what I can only assume was a trap designed to provoke you into violating blood law, which would then give the third house grounds to move against you politically." She lowered the syringe. "I am not injured. You are the one who just had a very bad evening." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "You understood all of that in the 30 seconds you were in this room." "I understood most of it in the 30 seconds before that," she said. while I was being dragged down the hall. He stepped closer. Not close enough to be anything other than concerned, but close enough that she could see the fine detail of him. The perfect white skin, the startling dark eyes. The way his jaw was set with something that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it. Something that looked more like fear, which was a thing she had never expected to see on his face. "I should not have let you come tonight," he said. "Valdis has been watching. He knows what you are to this court. He was using you." "I know," she said. "It worked out, Yelena." His voice was very low. It nearly did not. She looked at him, and for the first time all evening, she let herself feel the tremor that had been building behind her sternum since the moment cold hands had grabbed her in the corridor. She breathed through it. She did not let it reach her face, but she suspected, from the way his eyes changed, that he felt it anyway. He had always been preternaturally perceptive. "Then I suppose," she said, "that you had better tell me how we got here. Because I have been coming to this court for 3 months, and I think I deserve to understand why a member of the Third House just decided I was valuable enough to use as a political weapon." He held her gaze for a long, measuring moment. Then he turned, and he said, "Come with me. Not here. Somewhere I can explain properly." He paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder, and there was something in his expression that was almost reluctant. "There is a great deal I should have told you weeks ago." "Yes," she said, picking up her medical bag and the scattered vials from the floor, checking each one with quick, professional efficiency. "I suspected as much." She followed him out of the throne room, and the story that had brought her here, the real one, the complicated one, the one she had been assembling from fragments for 3 months, began to finally take its full shape. She had come to him because of a dying man. That was how most things in Yelena's life had begun, with someone who needed help, and with her inability to walk past that need. She had been a senior resident at Mercy General when the call had come through, in the way that unusual things always did in her experience. Quietly, and through a channel she had not expected. A private number, a woman's voice, calm and precise, explaining that there was a patient who required a healer with specific skills, that the patient was not human in the conventional sense, and that the compensation being offered was substantial enough to make her student loans feel like a distant memory. Yelena had asked exactly 3 questions. She had asked what was wrong with the patient. She had asked whether she would be in danger. She had asked whether the patient wanted to be helped. The 3rd question had given the woman on the phone a long pause. "That," the woman had said, "is what we are hoping you might be able to answer." The patient had been Orsino Malkavian, Prince of the Dusk Court, the oldest living vampire on the eastern seaboard, and he had been dying. Not in the way humans died, not with failing organs and narrowing margins, but in the older, stranger way that immortals sometimes chose to die, which was simply by deciding that they no longer wished to live. He had been withdrawing from blood for months. He had been retreating from his court, from his responsibilities, from the 700 years of political maneuvering and ancient obligation and careful power management that constituted his life. His people were frightened, his court was fracturing. The Third House, sensing weakness, had begun circling. Yelena had arrived in the private medical suite beneath his city residence, a converted mansion in the older part of the city, built over a network of underground chambers that were older than the city itself, and had found him in a chair by a window that had been heavily treated to filter ultraviolet light. He had been very still. He had been looking at the filtered sunlight with the expression of someone watching something they no longer believed they deserved. She had introduced herself. He had not moved. She had told him, with the frank, careful honesty she used with patients who needed truth more than comfort, that she understood he was in the process of choosing to end his life, and that she was not there to stop him if that was a genuine choice, made with full understanding of the alternatives, but that she would like, if he was willing, to talk with him about what had brought him to that choice. Not as a doctor. As someone who had sat with enough people in enough dark moments to know that sometimes the problem was not the darkness, but the isolation inside it. He had looked at her for a very long time. Then he had said, "You are not afraid of me." "I am a little afraid of you," she had replied honestly. "But it does not seem relevant right now." Something had shifted in his face, barely anything, a millimeter of change. But she had been watching and she had caught it. "Sit down," he had said, and there had been, beneath the exhaustion and the deliberate withdrawal, the faint ghost pressure of command in his voice. The voice of someone who had spent 7 centuries being obeyed and had simply never lost the habit. "If you intend to interrogate me about my own mortality, the least you can do is sit." She had sat. She had asked her questions, not the clinical ones she asked in hospitals, but the real ones, the ones she had learned mattered. She had listened with the particular quality of attention she had cultivated over years of practice, not waiting for her turn to speak, not cataloguing responses, but genuinely present, genuinely curious. He had not answered most of them that night, but he had answered some. And she had come back the next day, and the day after that, and over the following weeks, a strange, careful, unlikely relationship had built itself between them the way moss grows on old stone. Slowly, with patience, finding its footholds in the cracks, she had learned his history in fragments. 700 years of it, and much of it was genuinely terrible. He had outlived everyone who had ever mattered to him, had watched human civilization reshape itself a dozen times, had held a court together through centuries of internal politics and external threat. He had been prince since the age of 23, which in vampire terms meant he had been prince for so long the title had become indistinguishable from his identity. He did not know who he was without it, and he was increasingly uncertain the person who wore it had anything left worth preserving. That, Yelena had told him in the 5th week, is not a reason to die. That is a reason to find out who you actually are. He had looked at her across the low table, where she had begun bringing 2 cups of coffee. One for herself, one because the smell of fresh coffee was one of the few remaining sensory experiences he mentioned without neutrality, and she filed things like that carefully, and he had said, with the dry precision that she had learned was his particular form of humor. "You are very directive for a healer." "I am very directive for anyone," she had said. "It comes with the territory." "What territory?" "The territory of having decided at 17 that I was going to spend my life keeping people alive, and that I was going to do it well enough that it actually worked." She had looked at him steadily. "I have not always succeeded, but I have never once given up on a patient who had not already irreversibly given up on themselves." "You," she had said, "have not irreversibly given up. You are still sitting here talking to me." "Perhaps I find you interesting," he had said, and there had been something careful and slightly dangerous in the way he said it. The way certain precise things he said carried layers she was still learning to read. "I hope so," she had said. "I find you interesting too." That had been the turning point, though she had not known it at the time. Looking back, she could trace the shift from that evening, the very slight and significant change in the quality of his presence, the way he had begun to come to their sessions, rather than simply remaining in the room where they already were, the way he had started asking her questions in return. He had asked about her work, not politely, but with genuine, probing curiosity about the specifics of medicine, about how she thought about healing as a practice, about what she found difficult and what she found meaningful. He had asked about her life outside his residence, about the city, about the things she thought about on the long drive back to her apartment at night. He had listened to her answers with the same concentrated attention she had first brought to him, and she had found, to her own surprise, that being truly listened to by someone who had 7 centuries of context from which to understand the world was an experience unlike most others she had had. She had, at some point she could not precisely identify, stopped thinking of him as a patient. This was, she knew, medically problematic. She had also, at some point she could not precisely identify, stopped thinking of him as frightening. This was, she suspected, personally problematic, for different reasons, because Orsino Malkavian was, underneath the exhaustion and the withdrawal and the long grey weight of centuries, something she had not prepared herself for. He was kind. Not in the easy surface way, not with warmth that asked for nothing, but in the deeper, more demanding way. He was honest about hard things, protective of the people under his care, unwilling to pretend or perform, or simplify himself for anyone's comfort. He treated her intelligence as a given. He disagreed with her and expected her to disagree back. He remembered everything she had ever told him, down to the offhand detail, and he noticed when she was tired before she said so, and on one occasion when she had arrived after a brutal double shift with shadows under her eyes and a fragility she had been trying to disguise. He had wordlessly placed a cup of coffee in front of her and sat in silence for 10 minutes until she had recovered enough to speak. She had told herself this meant nothing. She had begun to suspect. With the clinical detachment she brought to problems, she did not want to feel yet that it meant a great deal. Now following him through the corridors of the residence, past the tall windows with their ultraviolet filtering glass and the walls hung with centuries of dark, beautiful art, she watched the set of his shoulders and thought about the way he had looked when he had walked through the door and seen a blade at her throat. He had been afraid. She was almost certain of it. Not for himself. He led her to his private study, a room she had been in many times but which still struck her every time as improbably beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of books in a dozen languages, a fireplace that burned clean and blue, low lights, and 2 chairs she had long ago claimed as a de facto medical consultation space. He poured her a glass of water without being asked and stood at the fireplace with his back to it, looking at her. "Sit down," he said, and she did. And for a moment he was quiet, gathering something. She recognized the shape of it. The pause before a difficult truth. "The third house has been moving against me for years," he began, and his voice was very measured, very precise. "Since before you arrived, since before I began," he stopped, began again. "Since the withdrawal became apparent to the court, Valdis is not acting independently. He is the instrument of his house lord, a vampire named Cerevane, who has coveted the Dusk Court's position for approximately 3 centuries and who has been waiting for a moment of vulnerability with the patience that only the very old can sustain." He met her eyes. "When you began coming here, when it became clear that you were having an effect I could not predict or explain, Cerevane shifted strategy. Rather than waiting for me to simply cease, he began looking for leverage. And I am leverage," she said. "You are a human who has access to the Prince of the Dusk Court at his most unguarded," Orsino said. "In the political language of the vampire world, that is either an extraordinary resource or an extraordinary vulnerability, depending on which side of the relationship you occupy." He held her gaze. "I have been trying to navigate this without revealing the extent to which you matter to this court." "The extent to which I matter to this court," she repeated carefully. "Or the extent to which I matter to you." A silence in the blue light of the fireplace. His face was utterly still, and she had learned to read the stillness. Learned that it was not the absence of feeling but its presence at a depth and pressure that had no other outlet. "Those are not separate things," he said finally. "And I think you know that." She did know it. She had known it for a while and had been being, she admitted to herself, somewhat cowardly about it. "Orsino," she said, and he looked at her with an attention that was almost physical. "Why did you not tell me about the danger? About Cerevane, about the third house moving against you? I have been walking into this residence for 3 months without understanding what I was walking into." "Because," he said, and his voice had something in it that she recognized after a moment as something close to shame. "I did not want you to stop coming, and I knew that if you understood the full danger, you might make the sensible decision." He paused. "I am not accustomed to wanting things the way I want." He stopped again, and then, with a precision that suggested he was being very deliberate, "The way I want you to continue to exist in my life. I handled it poorly. I kept information from you in order to protect a situation that I should have protected by being honest." She looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is the most direct admission of a mistake I have ever heard from you." "I am trying," he said, "to be better at that. You said, some time ago, that honesty about difficult things was more respectful than managing the truth for someone else's supposed benefit." He held her gaze. "I have been thinking about that since you said it." Something moved in her chest. She breathed through it. "All right," she said. "Then let me be honest in return. I am not going to stop coming. Not because I am unaware of the danger now, but because the danger does not change what I'm choosing to do." She held his gaze. "What I need is for you to stop making decisions about my safety without my input. I am not fragile. I am not helpless. I am a grown adult who is fully capable of weighing risks and making informed choices. And when you hide information from me in order to manage my decisions, you are treating me as something less than I am. Do you understand?" He was very still. Then slowly he said, "Yes, I understand." "Good," she said. "Then let's talk about Seravain." What followed was 3 hours of one of the most extraordinary conversations she had ever had. He told her everything. The full political landscape of the vampire courts, the blood law architecture that governed what any prince could do within his own territory and against other houses, the ancient vow structure that bound the courts to specific codes of non-aggression, the pressure points and leverage points, and the particular trap Seravain had been constructing for the last 18 months. She listened, asked precise questions, made him back up and clarify 3 times when the logic of the blood law seemed to contradict itself, and in so doing identified 2 angles that he had not considered, which she presented with the same straightforward confidence she brought to medical differentials. He listened to her the way he always did. But there was something additional tonight. A current beneath the conversation, the awareness of what had been said by the fire, the admission that had been made and received, and was now changing the shape of the air between them. "There is one other thing," he said finally, late into the night. The fire had burned lower. He was still standing, though she had learned that he did not tire the way she did, and could maintain any position with the same composure indefinitely. "Something I should tell you that I have been," he paused, and she saw the particular quality of stillness that preceded the things he found most difficult. "Avoiding." "Tell me," she said. He moved away from the fireplace and sat down in the other chair, which he almost never did, and the very fact of it made her pay a different kind of attention. "When you first came here," he said, "I told you that I had been withdrawing from blood. That is true, but it is not the complete truth." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I had been doing considerably more than that. I had been in the process of a deliberate, considered, entirely rational decision to end my existence, not in any impulsive sense. I had been planning it the way I plan everything, methodically, with full awareness of the consequences over several months." He held her gaze steadily. "I was 700 years old. I was exhausted in ways that no amount of rest could reach. I had outlived every person I had ever loved. The court was not something I was running out of passion, but out of habit and obligation, and I had come to believe, thoroughly and without drama, that the world would not be measurably worse for my absence." She did not look away. She did not speak yet. "You arrived," he continued, "and you sat down in my chair and you asked me whether I wanted to be helped. Not whether I needed help, whether I wanted it. And it was the first time in longer than I can accurately recall that anyone had treated my experience as something that required my own consent." He paused. "I did not know what to do with that. I found that I wanted to answer your question, which was not at that point something I had expected to want anything." "Orsino," she said softly. "I am not telling you this to place a burden on you," he said quickly, and she heard the care in it, the deliberate precision. "I am telling you because you asked me to stop withholding important context, and this is the most important context there is. You did not simply treat an illness. You gave me a reason to remain, and I think—" He stopped, and in the quiet she could hear the weight of everything he was choosing to say out loud for perhaps the first time. "I think you deserve to know that, whatever you do with it." She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "I am going to say something that is medically inadvisable and personally terrifying." He watched her. "I am not treating you anymore," she said. "I stopped treating you approximately 6 weeks ago. When I realized I was no longer thinking about you as a patient, I have been coming here because I want to, because of you specifically." She held his gaze with the same steadiness she brought to everything. "And the reason I was not afraid tonight, even with a blade at my throat, is not because I am incapable of fear. It is because some part of me knew, without any rational basis, that you would come through that door, and that certainty was, apparently, enough." The stillness in him changed quality. It became something different, something that was the stillness before motion rather than the stillness of restraint.
"Yelena," he said, and her name in his voice had a weight she felt in her sternum.
"I know," she said. "I know all the reasons this is complicated. Blood law, the court. The fact that you are 700 years old and immortal, and I am a human being with a lifespan you could count on a fraction of the time you have already lived." She let out a slow breath. "I know all of it. I am still sitting here." He rose from his chair and crossed the space between them, and she stayed very still, and he crouched down in front of her chair. An act of deliberate deference from someone who bent his knee for nothing, so that their eyes were level, and he looked at her with the full force of that ancient, extraordinary attention. "I have not wanted anything in a very long time," he said. "You should know that. When I say you gave me a reason to remain, I am not speaking in metaphor. I mean that you are, specifically, the reason I am still here, and that I am aware that is a significant thing to say, and that I am saying it without apology." He paused. "What I am not saying is that you owe me anything for it. You do not. You saved my life by being yourself, and that is yours, not mine." "I know," she said, "but I am choosing to be here anyway. That is also mine." He reached up and took her hand, carefully, the way he had always been careful with her. The way she had noticed from the very beginning, his impossible physical strength held in constant, conscious check, and her hand was cool and she could feel the centuries in it. The particular quality of something very old and very still that had found, against its own expectation, something to hold on to. "Then I would like," he said, Ed, with the formal precision that was his version of vulnerability, "to ask if I may begin things properly. Not as a prince to a human in his court. As the person who has spent 3 months becoming wholly insufficient without you, to the person who somehow arrived in my life and made it worth having again." She looked at him, and she felt the weight of everything they had both said settling into place, and she said simply, "Yes." He raised her hand to his lips, and the gesture was so perfectly, archaically him, so completely consistent with 7 centuries of a particular way of moving through the world, that she felt, for the first time in the entire evening, genuinely weak in the knees, which she considered slightly embarrassing given that she had faced a blade earlier and remained steady. But this was different. This was him, choosing to be gentle, and somehow that was the thing that got past all her competence. The threat of Seravain did not disappear, because they had said true things to each other by firelight. If anything, Yelena understood, in the days that followed, that it had intensified. The attack by Valdis had been a test, a probe to see how Orsino would respond, whether the human healer was a vulnerability or a protected asset. The answer Orsino had given by threatening the full weight of his court against third house protections had been loud and unmistakable, and it had told Seravain something important. She was not leverage. She was something more dangerous than leverage. She was the reason the Prince of the Dusk Court was no longer distracted by the process of his own dissolution. Yelena knew all of this because Orsino told her, every step of the way, with the new and deliberate honesty he had committed to. They sat in the study in the evenings, and he walked her through the chessboard of vampire court politics with the patience and precision of someone who had been playing the game for centuries. And she listened and contributed and asked questions, and they argued, productively, about strategy with the kind of intensity she had previously only experienced during the most demanding medical cases. She also continued to treat the members of his court who needed medical attention because she was who she was, and walking away from people who needed care was something she was genuinely incapable of. She treated Seraphine, the ancient vampire who served as the court's head of records, and who had developed a light sensitivity that went beyond normal vampire response. And she treated 2 of the younger court members who had been injured in a boundary dispute with a neighboring territory, and she worked with the court's own healers to develop better medical protocols in the language they understood. In between, she and Orsino were learning each other in the new register of something that was openly chosen. He was, she found, extraordinarily attentive in ways that surprised her. He brought her things without ceremony. A book she had mentioned once, a particular tea she had referenced in passing, the kind of small attentions that revealed how carefully he had been listening for much longer than she had known. He asked her about her life before him with genuine curiosity, wanting the detail of it, wanting to understand the architecture of the person she had become. He remembered every answer and asked follow-up questions days later. She, in turn, paid attention to him in the way she had always paid attention, but now with less of the professional distance. She noticed when the ancient weariness came back into his posture, not the deliberate withdrawal from before, but the ordinary weight of centuries. And she sat with him in it without trying to fix it, because she had learned the difference between supporting someone and trying to cure them of their own experience. She challenged him when she disagreed, which was frequent, and he responded to challenge with something that looked very much like delight, the particular pleasure of someone who had been too rarely met as an equal. He was protective in ways that she navigated carefully. Not controlling, there was a distinction, and he understood it intellectually, though she sometimes had to remind him of the difference in practice. He wanted her safe. He also wanted her free. The tension between those two things was something they were working out, and they were working it out by talking, which was, she thought, about as healthy as a relationship between an immortal vampire prince and a human healer could possibly be. 3 weeks after the night in the throne room, Seraveni moved. It was not an attack. It was more elegant than that, and Yelena appreciated the elegance even as she recognized the danger. Seraveni brought a formal complaint before the full council, the governing body of the vampire courts, which met in a chamber beneath the old financial district, accessible through 3 separate hidden passages, and lit entirely by bioluminescent panels that approximated the spectrum of moonlight. The complaint cited Orsino's threat to the Third House blood law protections as a violation of the non-aggression covenant that governed inter-house relations. Orsino received the summons and told her about it that evening, as he had committed to doing, and she looked at the formal document, printed on heavy card, sealed in dark wax. Written in a Latin variant she could read because she had spent the last month learning it for exactly this kind of purpose. And she said, "This is actually the trap. The throne room incident was the setup. If you defend yourself before the council the way you would naturally defend yourself, you give Seraveni what he needs to escalate." "Yes," Orsino said, "and if you don't appear, it reads as an admission." "Also yes." She was quiet for a moment, thinking through it with the same focused energy she brought to diagnostic puzzles. "But you have standing to bring a counter-argument based on the original provocation. Valdis held a human member of your court at knife point. Under blood law, does the protection of a sanctioned human guest supersede the non-aggression covenant?" He stared at her. That is a 700-year-old question. The precedent is from a council ruling in the 16th century. And the precedent supports your reading. He was very still in the particular way that meant he was rapidly recalculating. The case was Harrow v. the Second House, a human scribe. The council ruled that a prince's duty of protection to a sanctioned human within his territory constitutes a blood law obligation that supersedes non-aggression protocol. "So Valdis violated blood law first," Yelena said. "Not you. You were defending a blood law obligation." "Yes." He looked at her with an expression she had come to love, the one that was equal parts admiration and something softer, the one that he let her see now without hiding it. "Yes, that is exactly the argument." "Then we go to the council," she said. "Together, I will not bring you into the council chamber. The politics, she said calmly, "require that I be there. I am the protected human. My testimony is the evidence. If you leave me at home and go argue an abstract point of law, you are going to be arguing against someone who has been working this case for months and has counter-arguments prepared. If I am there, in person, telling the council what happened, Seraveni has to argue against an eyewitness account of his own operative violating blood law." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are," he said, "the most formidable person I have encountered in several centuries. I am a doctor who has spent 15 years arguing with hospital administrators," she said. "A vampire council is simply a higher stakes version of the same problem." He smiled. It was one of the rare, full smiles that she had catalogued carefully, each one a small triumph over the weight he carried. The council session was unlike anything she had experienced. The chamber was vast and ancient and cold, lit by those strange, silver spectrum panels, lined with carved stone that she thought was genuinely Roman in origin. The 12 council members sat in a semicircle on elevated benches, all of them white-haired and pale and centuries old, and they regarded her with a variety of expressions ranging from open curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Seraveni was there. She saw him for the first time. He was tall and very still, with the particular quality of very old vampires, as though he occupied time differently than the room around him. He regarded her with cold, calculating attention, and she met his gaze and held it. and she saw something move across his face that was, she thought, a recalibration. Orsino stood beside her, and the fact of his standing rather than sitting in the prince's seat on the floor of the chamber was a statement in itself. He was with her, not presiding over her. She had asked him about this in advance, whether it would read as weakness, and he had said, with the directness she had come to rely on, that in the context of the blood law argument they were making, standing beside the person he had a sworn obligation to protect was not weakness but demonstration. She gave her testimony. She was precise, specific, and clinical, dates, times, physical details, the exact words spoken, and she spoke with the same steady authority she used when presenting complex cases to hospital review boards. She did not dramatize. She did not appeal for sympathy. She laid out the facts and let the facts be what they were. Orsino made the legal argument. He was extraordinary at it, she thought, in the way that people who have spent centuries practicing something become extraordinary, precise and authoritative, and utterly unshakable, citing precedents from memory with the ease of someone reading from a text he carried internally. Seravain's response was careful and sophisticated, and ultimately insufficient, because the facts were what they were, and the precedent was what it was, and the council's deliberation was, in the end, relatively brief. The ruling came from the council's first speaker, a vampire called Vethran, who had been listening throughout with an expression of composed neutrality, and who delivered the finding with the economy of someone who had done this for a very long time. Valdis had violated blood law. The third house action against the Dusk Court's sanctioned human had constituted an unprovoked violation of the guest protection obligation. Orsino's response had been within the bounds of a prince's defensive duties. Seravain's formal complaint was dismissed. The third house was ordered to stand down from all current actions against the Dusk Court, and then Vethran added something that had not been explicitly requested. He said that given the nature of the event and the human's demonstrated value to the court and the prince, the council would formally record Yelena Dumont as a protected person under the full weight of Dusk Court blood law, which meant that any action against her by any vampire under the council's authority would be treated as a direct action against Orsino himself. The chamber was very quiet for a moment. Orsino stood very still beside her. She reached over without thinking and touched his hand briefly, and he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, something that was wonder and relief, and the particular raw quality of someone who has been in a fight for a very long time and has suddenly been told it is over. "Thank you," she said, very quietly, to Vethran, and the ancient vampire looked at her for a moment with something that was almost warmth. "The law," Vethran said, "occasionally produces the correct outcome. Today is one of those occasions." Seravain left without speaking. She watched him go and thought about the fact that this was not over, not permanently. He was old and patient, and the ambition that had been driving him would not simply stop because of a council ruling, but it was contained, for now. For now was enough to work with. Walking out of the chamber with Orsino beside her, back through the hidden passage and up into the winter air of the old city, she breathed in the cold and let herself feel the adrenaline finally leaving her system, the long, gradual decompression of a body that had been running on high alert. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I will be," he said, and there was a quality to it, not the old exhausted flatness, but something more like the voice of someone genuinely present in the moment, engaged with what was happening. "I find that I am more all right than I expected. Because it worked." He looked at her as they walked. The city was quiet around them. Late at night, the old streets wet from earlier rain, the light from the street lamps making the wet stone glow amber. He looked thoroughly, completely himself in that moment, ancient and other and impossibly beautiful, and also, somehow here, genuinely here with her in a way that she had been watching build for months. "Because," he said, "I was not alone in it." She stopped walking, and he stopped with her, and she turned to face him on the wet street, and she said, because she was who she was, and she had learned the value of saying true things, "I love you." I am aware that is a significant statement, and that there are considerable complications attached to it, and I have been thinking about it for some time, and I have decided to say it, because not saying it seemed like the kind of thing I would regret. He looked at her. The amber stripe caught his white hair and the extraordinary precision of his face, and the dark eyes that had centuries behind them, and were, at this particular moment, focused on her with an absolute intensity that was slightly overwhelming, and also, she found, exactly right. "Yelena," he said, and her name in his voice had its full weight now, unguarded. "I have loved you since the third week. Since you told me that the fact that I was still talking to you was itself a reason. I have been." He paused, and she saw the familiar gathering before something true. "I have not known how to say it in a way that was not burdensome. You came to help me, and I was afraid that what I felt was something you had caused by doing your work well, rather than something real and separate from that. I needed to understand the difference before I could say it." "And have you?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I love you in the way that has nothing to do with what you saved me from. I love you because of who you are, when you are simply being yourself, without any particular reason to be extraordinary. Which is the problem with you. You are extraordinary without effort, and it is extremely inconvenient when you are trying to maintain appropriate emotional perspective." She laughed, a real and warm laugh, and he watched it with the expression he sometimes had when she laughed. The expression of someone encountering something they had not expected to find available to them. She stepped forward and kissed him, there on the wet amber street, and he kissed her back with the same deliberate, full attention he brought to everything. And it was not tentative, and it was not uncertain, and it was exactly as profound as she had suspected it would be, because this was Orsino, and he was incapable of doing anything by halves. The weeks that followed were the strangest and best weeks of her life. They were not without difficulty. There were long conversations about what their relationship meant in the context of the court, what it meant for her safety, what it meant in practical terms, given that she was human and he was not. These were conversations they had together, with full information on both sides, which made them productive rather than fraught. She raised, herself, the obvious question. The one she had been thinking about since the early weeks of truly knowing him. The question of whether she wanted to remain human, and whether that was something they should discuss. He listened to the whole question before he said anything. Then he said, very carefully, that there were ways, blood law ways, ancient vow ways, deeply complicated, and not entirely reversible ways, by which a human could be brought into the vampire world more fully. That this was not a simple or trivial thing, that he would never ask it of her or suggest she should want it, but that since she was raising it, he would not pretend it was not possible. She asked him to explain the process. He did, all of it with the precision and the honesty that was his particular form of love. She listened and thought about it for 3 days with the same rigor she would bring to any major decision, and then she came to him and said that she had reached no conclusion yet, that this was not a decision she intended to make quickly or under any kind of pressure, and that she would like them to agree to revisit it in 1 year, when they had more experience of each other and she had more information. He said, "Yes, of course. Take all the time you need. I have patience in quantities you cannot imagine," she said. "I can imagine quite a lot." He smiled fully and completely, and she stored that smile away in the collection she kept, and thought about the extraordinary specific nature of his patience and his care. There remained the question of Seravain. She had known they would have to return to it. She had been right that the council ruling was not a permanent resolution, because permanent resolutions to political ambitions as old as Seravain's were not achieved through single legal victories. She discussed this with Orsino over the following months, and they built a strategy together, her clinical precision applied to political mapping, his centuries of knowledge of the court structures and the pressure points and the alliances that could be shifted. The strategy involved 3 things. The first was strengthening the Dusk Court's existing alliances with the 2 most powerful neutral houses, the second and the fifth, which had been weakening through Orsino's period of withdrawal and needed deliberate, attentive rebuilding. He did this through the formal processes of vampire diplomacy, with Yelena's perspective on what the other house's leaders seemed to actually want versus what they were presenting as their position. A kind of reading between lines she was good at, and that proved useful. The second was Seraphine, the ancient court records keeper whose light sensitivity Yelena had been treating was also the keeper of 3 centuries of dusk court records that contained, buried in the meticulous documentation of court transactions, a sequence of events from the early 19th century that showed Seravain's house had violated blood law on 3 separate occasions that had been quietly buried rather than brought to the council. Yelena had found it, not because she had been looking for it specifically, but because she had asked Seraphine about the history of the guest protection precedent, and Seraphine had pulled the relevant archive, and Yelena had read the surrounding documents with her habit of reading everything in context. She brought the documents to Orsino, and he had been very still for a long time. "This," he said, "is significant. This," she said, "is leverage, real leverage. Not the manipulative kind that Seravain uses. The kind that gives him a genuine choice. Stand down permanently or have 3 centuries of hidden blood law violations presented to the council." "This could destroy the third house," Orsino said quietly. "Which is why we do not present it unless he moves against the dusk court again," she said. "It is a deterrent, not a weapon. The goal is stability, not destruction." He looked at her. "You would make an extraordinary diplomat. I am a doctor," she said. "Diplomacy is just triage with better clothes." The third piece was simpler and more unexpected. Valdis, who had been the instrument of the throne room attack, came to Orsino privately 6 weeks after the council ruling. He came without the court's knowledge, through one of the secondary approaches to the residence, and he asked to speak with Orsino and with Yelena both. What he said was that he had been acting under coercion, that Seravain held an ancient vow over him, a binding obligation from the 16th century, that Valdis's ancestor had made under duress, and that had passed to Valdis as the current house representative. That the threat against Yelena in the throne room had not been what Valdis had intended when he agreed to be part of Seravain's plan. He had expected to confront Orsino alone, and the human healer had been added to the scenario at Seravain's instruction without Valdis's knowledge until it was too late to withdraw. Yelena watched him as he spoke. She watched him the way she watched patients, looking for the involuntary signals that told her things the words did not. And what she saw in Valdis was exhaustion and something she recognized as genuine distress. She said, "The binding obligation. If Orsino nullified it, if the ancient vow were dissolved through legal means, would you be free to stand against Seravain?" Valdis looked at her. He had not expected that question from her. "Yes," he said after a moment. "But the dissolution of a vow of that age requires council sanction and the agreement of both affected houses." "We have a document," Orsino said slowly, following where she was leading. "That gives us considerable standing with the council where Seravain is concerned." The dissolution took another 4 months. It was complicated, as every legal process in the vampire world seemed to be, with the particular complexity that came from laws and precedents spanning centuries. But Vethran, the first speaker, who had shown himself to be a fair interpreter of the law, facilitated the process, and the documentation from Seraphine's archive proved decisive. When it was done, and Valdis was free of the binding obligation, and Seravain was formally presented with the evidence of his house's historical violations, as a condition of the negotiated agreement that ended the conflict without the destruction of the third house, Yelena sat in Orsino's study and felt the long, accumulated tension of the past 7 months finally begin to genuinely release. Orsino sat in his chair, the one she still thought of as his, and watched her with that particular quality of attention that she had stopped trying to deflect. "It is over," he said. "It is considerably better," she said. "I will accept considerably better as over for practical purposes." "You should feel proud of this," he said. "This outcome was not something I would have reached without you." "This outcome was reached by us," she said. "That is the part that matters." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to tell you something about what this last year has meant." "Tell me," she said. "When you first came," he said, "I was in the process of ending, not dramatically. Quietly, and with complete conviction, I had decided carefully that the world had nothing more in it that I needed to remain for. I was not wrong, exactly. The world I had been in had nothing left. But I had made the error of assuming that the world was what I knew of it." He held her gaze. "You came from outside what I knew. You came with a way of thinking and a way of being that was entirely new to me, And the thing that brought me back was not treatment or intervention or any particular act of healing. It was the simple experience of being with someone who was interested in me, who challenged me, who disagreed with me, who was honest with me, and who came back the next day anyway. He paused. You gave me something to be curious about again. You gave me a reason to want to know what was going to happen next. That is not a small thing. For someone who had stopped believing the next thing would matter. She looked at him for a long moment, and she felt everything she felt for him very fully. Without the careful professional distance and without the self-protective judging she sometimes still caught herself reaching for. For the record, she said, you were not a therapeutic project for me. You know that. I know, he said. You were the most genuinely interesting person I had ever met, she said. You are difficult and old, and you have strong opinions about everything, and you remember information like a database, and you are sometimes infuriatingly calm when I want you to react, and you make me feel more like myself than anything else in my life. She paused. You are also the reason I have started learning 4 languages simultaneously, and have developed a working knowledge of vampire court law, and have spent the last 7 months doing political strategy as a side career alongside medicine. So there is an argument that you have expanded my professional portfolio considerably. He smiled, and it was the full, rare, unreserved version. I would like, he said, to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it with the same honesty you bring to everything. All right, she said. Will you stay? He asked. Not temporarily. Not as a healer, not as a consultant, not as anything except exactly what you already are to me. Will you be here? In this court, in this life, with me? She heard everything he was not saying, the immortal weight of it, the complications, the question beneath the question about permanence and time and what she would choose when she was ready to choose. She heard all of it, and she answered the thing he was actually asking. Yes, she said, I am already here. He rose from his chair and came to her, and she met him in the middle of the room the way she had been meeting him all year. As herself, fully present without performance or pretense. He took her face in his hands, carefully as always, with all of that precise, conscious gentleness, and looked at her with the eyes that had 7 centuries behind them and were at this moment entirely, completely present. I should tell you, he said, that I had not intended to fall in love. I had considered it, in general terms, an experience I was beyond. I want to be clear that you have thoroughly disproved this assumption, and that I hold you entirely responsible. I accept that responsibility, she said. Good, he said, and kissed her with everything he was, old and strange and extraordinary and hers. And she kissed him back with everything she was, which was younger and human and entirely certain. The year turned, and the year after that. The court settled into a new stability, one that was built on better foundations than what had preceded it. The alliances were real rather than obligatory, the blood law architecture was cleaner, and the Prince of the Dusk Court was, for the first time in the memory of anyone currently serving, genuinely engaged with the work of ruling rather than simply sustaining it. Seraphine, whose light sensitivity Yelena had continued to treat and had finally resolved through a compound developed over 18 months of careful work, presented Yelena with a formal court title on behalf of the full council of the Dusk Court, sanctioned healer of the court, which was an ancient designation that had not been given to a human in over 400 years. Yelena accepted it with the specific quality of gracious matter-of-factness she brought to things that moved her, which was to say, she thanked Seraphine with complete sincerity, and then went quietly into Orsino's study, and sat for a few minutes with her hands in her lap, and let herself feel the full weight of belonging to something real and permanent. Orsino found her there and sat beside her without asking why, which was one of the 1,000 small things she had catalogued as evidence of who he was, and they sat together in the quiet of the study that had become more home to her than any other place she had been. She had made her decision about the question they had agreed to revisit. She had taken the full year, and then a second year, and she had gathered all the information she could, and she had talked with Orsino in full detail about every aspect of what it meant, and she had consulted with Seraphine and with Vethran and with 2 other vampires whose perspectives she had come to value, and she had made the decision the way she made all important decisions, carefully, with full information, and from herself rather than from fear or pressure. She told him on an evening in the 3rd year, in the study with the fireplace burning blue and the shelves around them, full of books in 12 languages, and the city invisible above them, and the old, stone-walled world of the dusk court around them, like something both ancient and alive. "I have decided," she said, "that I want to remain human." He looked at her. "Not because the alternative is frightening," she said, "and not because I have any ambivalence about my commitment to this life, to this court, or to you, but because I have thought about it from every angle, and I think that what I bring to this world, what makes me genuinely useful to you and to the people here, including what made me able to see things that needed seeing when I first came, is connected to being human, to the urgency of it, the finitude of it, the way it makes me look at problems differently." She held his gaze. "I think I am best at what I do because I am what I am, and I would rather be genuinely myself for however long I have than something else for longer." He was quiet for a moment. "I would never have asked you to change," he said. "I know," she said. "That is partly why I can make this choice, freely." "And the time," he said, and she heard everything in it, the centuries he had already lived, the centuries he would continue to live, the arithmetic of it. "The time," she said steadily, "is what it is. I am not afraid of it. I do not think the length of a thing determines its value. I think the quality of it does." She looked at him. "You gave me this philosophy, actually. You told me in the first month that you had lived 700 years and felt less in most of them than you felt in the weeks since I arrived. That has stayed with me." He looked at her for a long time, and she saw the weight of everything he felt. The complexity of loving someone mortal, the knowledge of what lay ahead, the deep earned capacity for loss that centuries had built in him. She saw all of it, and she did not look away from any of it. "Then," he said, "I will spend every year we have been grateful for them. That," she said, "is all I need." The court continued and the seasons passed. Yelena split her time between the hospital, where she continued to work because she would not stop being a doctor, simply because she now also had an ancient, complicated, extraordinary second life, and the dusk court, where she had become something the court had not had before. A human who was genuinely of the court, not a peripheral figure or a political token, but someone who understood its laws and its history and its people, and who contributed to it from inside, the peace with Seravain held, not warmly but reliably. Valdis, freed of the ancient vow, proved to be a thoughtful and capable member of the broader council, and he and Yelena developed a professional respect that was, she thought, probably as close to friendship as the ancient politics of their respective worlds would allow. Vethran, who she encountered at quarterly council sessions, regarded her with what she had eventually decided was genuine respect, and once, in the corridor outside the chamber, he had stopped her and said, simply, that the dusk court was in better health than it had been in living memory, and that the council was aware of the role she had played in that. "I did not do it alone," she had said. "No," he had agreed. "But you gave him the reason to do it at all. That is not nothing." On an evening that was neither particularly ceremonial nor particularly special, an ordinary evening, the fire blue and low, the city quiet above them, the shelves of books casting their familiar shadows, Orsino gave her something. He reached into his coat and placed in her hands an old object, small and extraordinarily intricate, a pendant on a dark chain, worked in the particular style of the court that she had come to recognize as 16th century. She looked at it and then at him. "It belonged to the last person I loved before the world became too heavy," he said. "She died 400 years ago, and I have kept this in the understanding that it would never be given to anyone again, because I had decided that love was a thing I had finished with." He paused. "I was wrong. I wanted you to have it not as a gift, but as evidence. Evidence that whatever you gave me by coming through that door on the first evening, it reached all the way back. It reached the parts that I had been certain were finished." She closed her hands around the pendant. "Orsino," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said, in the specific, complete, thoroughly unhedged sense, without reservation and without ambivalence. "I love you the way that people love things that are genuinely worth loving." He looked at her with all of his centuries and all of his presence, and the ancient exhaustion that had been his defining quality when she first met him was still there. It was part of him, and it always would be. But it was not the dominant thing anymore. The dominant thing was something else. Something that looked, she thought, like a person who had found their reason and was holding it carefully. "I know," he said, "I know you do, and it remains every day the most extraordinary thing that has happened to me in 700 years. He put his arms around her and she leaned into him, into the cool and the permanency of him, and outside the old stone walls of the dust-caught the city, moved through its ordinary nighttime rhythms, human and oblivious. And in the blue-lit quiet she thought about the chain of events that had brought her here. A phone call, a dying man, in a chair by a filtered window. 3 questions she had asked, and the third one that had changed everything. Whether he wanted to be helped, he had wanted to be helped. He had wanted it in ways he had not known until someone came along and asked the right question, which was, she thought, the fundamental truth of healing. Not that healers fixed things, but that they created the conditions in which the thing that needed to happen could happen. She had not saved him. He had saved himself, as people always did, when someone gave them enough of the right kind of attention. She had simply been the reason. The pendant was warm in her hand now, warmed by her own warmth, and she thought about 400 years of keeping, and about the moment it had been placed in her hands instead. And she thought that this was what it looked like when someone came back from the edge of leaving. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, daily, in the ordinary accumulation of mornings that turned into years, in the coffee cups and the disagreements and the conversations about blood law and the political strategies and the laughter in the study and the long, quiet evenings that were simply 2 people being alive in each other's company. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, careful and deliberate. "Stay," he said quietly, not asking, simply saying what was true. "I am already here," she said, as she always did. As she would continue to say for every year she had, and as she meant with every part of herself that was capable of meaning something. Outside, the city hummed on in its ordinary darkness. Inside, the fire burned blue, and the vampire who had given up on living, and the healer who had come to give him a reason, sat together in the particular piece of people who had found each other through the worst of everything, and had chosen, simply and completely, and with full information, to stay.